And then last but not least, let me introduce Sarah Brown to you. So Sarah is a double alum from TU. She has her Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and then also her JD from TU College of Law. So just a little bit about her. She is passionate about human relations and helping people gain the competitive edge by using etiquette and professionalism. Sarah is the founder of SavvyFiles.com, an etiquette blog that discusses modern etiquette and answers readers' etiquette questions. Sarah creates modern etiquette training programs for companies and civic organizations. She helps organizations manage customer relations and employee relations by creating unique professionalism workshops focusing on etiquette and interpersonal communication skills. Sarah focuses on bridging communication gaps between people to create a culture of civility. Sarah's consulting firm Upgrowth Group LLC provides executive coaching services, organizational culture audits, and training and developmental programs. Sarah works for the SAC and Fox Nation. Prior to her work in tribal government, she was general counsel for a private oil and gas company. Her legal practice has included civil litigation, insurance defense, and business law. Sarah is an adjunct college professor and teaches American government and politics and American jurisprudence. We talked about her going to TU, and then she also lives in Oklahoma. So I'm going to let Sarah tell you a little bit more about her story. Take it away.
Thank you, Brooke. Good afternoon, everyone. Like Brooke said, I'm Sarah, and I'm so happy to be spending a little bit of time with my TU family. Like Brooke said, I'm a proud alum of TU. I got my bachelor's from TU and also went to law school and graduated from TU College of Law. So thank you to my TU family for having me. I'm really excited to spend some time with you all today. I want to recognize that we're all going through a very difficult time right now. So please know that I'm aware of that and I understand we have a lot going on right now. But hopefully this will still give you some tools to think about, to skills to work on while we're all sheltering in place and staying safe. And I hope you all stay safe. Brooke covered my background, but I have been an etiquette trainer for a little over a decade now, and I'm just really passionate about it. I'm an attorney by trade, but my passion lies in human relations and employee relations. So I'm happy to spend some time with you today to kind of give you some practical skills for Netiquette. And if you're wondering, what is Netiquette? It's simply etiquette online, right? Netiquette is the protocol, practices of etiquette of anything you're doing on the net, right? The World Wide Web. So that's everything from posting on social media platforms to emails, things like that. What we're going to do today is, you can see my screen here, is we're going to kind of talk about the current state of affairs in the workplace, which is drastically different from what it was just a month ago. We're going to talk about why etiquette is important, how it can help you to that next step. We're going to talk about virtual communication, obviously, right? How can you communicate in a professional manner with employers, whether it be an employer you currently have, if you already have a job, an internship, or one that you're trying to get a job with. And then we're going to really close out the session with some practical etiquette tips that you can put to use today. So Brooke already mentioned this, but we will have some time for Q&A at the end. And also at the end of this, I'm going to put up a screen share of my contact information. I'm more than happy to answer any follow-up questions. I'm accessible on LinkedIn for messaging, and I'll also share my email address with you. So with all that being said, welcome. Let's relax. Let's learn some practical tips that we can use to boost our communication game. So the first thing is, we need to talk about, what does the modern workplace look like, right? Think about, if you have an internship, if you have a job, what does it look like, right? And we already know some things, right? This comes from Forbes. We know that unfortunately 53% of Americans are unhappy at work. Stats show us that 58% of people say they trust strangers more than their own boss, which that's saddening, right? That's disheartening. We also know that 78% of workers said that their commitment to their organization declined in the face of rude behavior. Right, so what does this tell us? This is before we've all switched to working from home. So already we have a mountain to climb with just a tough workplace, right? I don't say that to be negative. I say that so we kind of understand why our interpersonal communication skills are so important. Now, we also have to talk about the different generations that are in the workplace, right? For the first time in our modern age, there are 5 generations in the workplace. We have traditionalists, baby boomers, we have Generation X, we have millennials. Millennials are also known as Generation Y, and we have iGen, also known as Generation Z. Now, sometimes you see these categories may be different by a couple years. This comes from the Center for Generational Kinetics. But the point of this is we have 5 generations in the workplace. I think this is great. I think the more perspectives, differing perspectives you can get only enhances a workplace, right? There's a lot of good to this. But we also know there can be some communication challenges. There can be some communication gaps when you have 5 different generational cohorts in one place, right? And you know this. You see this all over. I just pulled some headlines, from Google, right? There's this generational communication gap happening, right? One generation blames another, things like that. But these really lie in stereotypes. And we all know stereotypes are not always accurate, right? It doesn't matter what age you are. I have people that are much older than me that are way more tech savvy, right? That's one stereotype that is not always true, that you have to be younger to be tech savvy. My point being, there's a lot of good with generational differences, but we have to recognize there sometimes is a communication gap. And this is where honing your interpersonal communication skills come in. If we as employees, as students, as members of any organization really focus on our own interpersonal communication skills, that's going to contribute to a culture of civility in the workplace. So why does that matter, right? Why does etiquette matter? Well, it's because we're all trying to be professional. If I asked you right now to think about a professional you respect, right? You can do that. I know I can. There's a lot of professionals I respect. But on the other end, if I ask you to think about someone who maybe is a bit rude in the workplace, yeah, unfortunately, I can think of someone like that too, right? So this is why it matters, is you are building your personal brand. You're building your professional reputation. And we know this. Even now, with the working from home environment, we know technical skills are not enough. You must have interpersonal skills. Why? Healthy relationships are the basis of a healthy work environment. We know that the foundation of any interpersonal relationship is communication, and that's all etiquette is. Etiquette is a form of communication. So I know a lot of you maybe have already taken some etiquette courses, but all I'm going to help you with today is to point out some tips and practices that you probably already know. It might be more of a refresher to make sure that you are encouraging positive relationships. So back to where we are. It's estimated that 65% of workplace performance problems are from strained relationships, not from a deficit in a skill or the employee's motivation. All right, I'm just going to let you think about that for a minute. The majority of our workplace performance problems are from strained relationships, not from a lack of skill, right? So we see employers all the time focusing on technical skills, work skills, and those are very important. Of course they are. We all have to have a technical skill. But at the same time, those soft skills, as they're often known, interpersonal communication, are also very important too for the efficiency of any workplace. So why does etiquette matter, right? We've already kind of gone over this, but it improves communication. It creates a culture of civility. I always joke that my personal mission is to improve any organization I'm in by contributing to the culture of civility. It decreases personnel complaints. Some of the stats I previously showed kind of highlight that if we can decrease personnel complaints, we spend less time working on HR issues and more time working on the core of the business. It improves morale, right? Like you want to go to work and be happy. And also it enhances your personal brand. And this is why I think trainings like this are so great for students and alums, is because we can all work on our personal brand every day. So I want you to think for a moment, what do you want your personal brand to be? Right? Do you want to be professional, courteous, respectful, hospitable, an excellent communicator? Think about that for a minute. I always want my personal brand to be professional and strong, right? And sometimes this changes. But as we move through this webinar, I want everyone to think, what do you want your personal brand to be? Right? And maybe these tips we're going to go over will help contribute to that as you build your personal brand. Okay, now let's get into kind of the meat here. Let's talk about virtual communication, right? And I've highlighted here 6 important takeaways you can use when you're virtually communicating. We're going to go through virtual communication tips. Then, like I said, we're going to switch into actual Netiquette and etiquette tips for emailing, phone conferences, web conferences, things like that. All right. So the first thing we need to know is we have to compensate for the loss of body language, right? We all know that nonverbal communication, body language, body posture is an essential element of communicating in a positive way with people. Well, we're in this tough position where we have lost the use of body language, right? You can see me right now and that's great, but there's going to be a lot of times we're on a phone conference. So to compensate for this, we have to really focus on making sure our communication is clear and concise, right? We've lost a key element of communication. So we have to make sure we're being clear and concise on every communication, every correspondence. All right, we have to make sure we're matching the technology to the task right now. And that's something you need to make sure you're asking your employer or potential employer. How would you like to meet in quotes right now? Would you like to email to discuss this, talk on the phone, webinars, phone conferences? There's a variety of things we can do, but you also have to make sure you're matching the technology to the task. Know where your strengths are at. If you know that you are better on Skype, ask for Skype. However, if you're a person that can perform better on telephone, ask to use a phone conversation as opposed to a video conference. Let's move on to number 3. Watch for unintended negativity in your emails. So studies have proven that for whatever reason, we often are a little bit more negative in writing, right? So I know I've found this to be true, and this was pointed out to me with someone I've worked with. I've started noticing, and yes, I often come across a little bit more negative in my emails. So we want to make sure that you're looking for not just unintended negativity, but any unintended consequences in your emails. That's about the tone. We're going to talk about tone of email in a little bit. We'll really dive into this. All right, number 4, we want to make sure we're still using our public speaking tips when you're on conference calls and webinars. We're going to talk more about this in a bit as well. Also, you want to remember, communication is for the other person, right? When I'm communicating, I already know what I'm thinking and feeling inside. My goal is to make sure you understand that. So you have to make sure you're considering the person you're communicating with, their point of view, their lens. And also, we don't want to bury the lead when we're virtually communicating. And all my journalism majors recognize that I did not misspell lead. Bury the lead comes from a journalism saying, where you never want to bury the most important point, right? Lead with your strongest point. And this is essential when you're virtually communicating. You want to make sure you're addressing the most important point at the beginning. Don't bury the lead. All right, let's talk about some virtual communication pitfalls. So the first one is disregarding company policies and remote work protocols. So if you currently are employed, remember your company policies are still in play. Also, a lot of companies, as they have switched to remote work, have send out remote work policies, remote work protocols. You want to make sure you're abiding and following the policies and protocols, right? Just because we're working from home or working over a webinar doesn't mean we can ignore the policies already in place. You also want to watch out for humor and context, meaning don't make a joke that others won't get. I think humor is so important right now, and I love people who are being humorous. But at the same time, humor is very difficult to get across when you're emailing, texting on the phone. And so you might want to avoid that. And also make sure you're not tone deaf, right? You have to recognize what's going on. Humor works best when people get the context. So if you cannot get across the context, don't try to share the humor. And of course, this is for business communication. I would never tell people to stop being humorous with their social communications with their friends. Remember, this is related to business communication. All right, the third one is your failure to acknowledge missteps. Here's something we all need to understand. We're all going to have a failure at some point. This is hard, right? Transitioning to working from home and virtual communication only is difficult. When you mess up, address it and move on. But remember, you don't want to ignore it. So for example, I hope this doesn't happen, but if I get disconnected for some reason, right, I'm going to come back, I'm going to acknowledge it, apologize, and move on. All right, the other pitfall I want to discuss is ignoring business hours. People still have their business hours, meaning you don't want to call someone for a work call at 10 o'clock at night, right? Every business, every professional is different right now, but still be considerate of the business hours. And this is an old customer service trick, but remember, when you're virtually communicating, customer service experts always tell us the most important part of an interaction is the beginning and the end, right? We want to start strong, we want to end strong. So as you're starting to virtually communicate with employers, think about the first impression you make. And then you also want to make sure you're ending the interaction on a positive note. So I want to keep that in mind as well as we move forward. All right. A trick I like to use when I'm communicating virtually with employers is note taking, right? It's so simple, but it's so important, especially right now. And I typically divide my paper kind of in 4 quadrants like you're seeing on the screen. And we want to make sure that before any virtual communication begins, that you have set your goals and your objectives prior to the communication beginning. Preparation is key. If you take one thing away from this, that should be it. Preparation is key for positive virtual communications. So a lot of my communication majors out there will probably recognize this. We know that goals of communication are to inform, to request, to persuade, and to build relationships, right? So before you get on a conference call or a webinar with an employer, make sure you have these goals in mind, right? What information do you need to share? What information do you need to receive? And what's your overall objective? And then also remember, every time we communicate with someone, it gives us an opportunity to build that relationship. And I think this is so important, especially right now, to maintain and build those relationships. And remember, a lot of the traditional etiquette rules are still going to apply to virtual situations. For example, let's say you're interviewing, right? A lot of you are probably right in the middle of interviewing with employers. So I want to just remind you, etiquette rules can still apply. So let's say when you're preparing for an interview, right? Just like you would ask about the details before, you should ask about the video conferencing technology, right? How will this interview go down? Who are you meeting with? Remember, the business dress rules still apply. We're not going to get into that type of etiquette today, the different categories of business dress, but just keep that in mind that you should still dress in a business appropriate manner. Then during an interview, right? I always say proper introductions are key when you go into an interview. You can still do that virtually. Remember, you want to make sure you're still silencing your cell phone and also staying engaged, right? So whatever you need to do, you know yourself better than anyone. Whatever you need to do to eliminate distractions, do it. And the purpose for that is not so you seem like a robot and you're not in your house, right? Right now I'm in my home. The purpose of limiting distractions is to make sure you're staying engaged, right? We want to make sure that we're also following proper etiquette rules after an interview, right? You want to make sure you're sending a thank you note, which right now it's probably more likely you're going to be sending an email to thank them for the interview. And then also you have that second follow-up. The first follow-up is the thank you. The second follow-up is just the typical follow-up. So people ask a lot of questions about this. Remember, the typical timeline is 7 to 10 business days after you sent your thank you. If they haven't responded, you can reach back out. But I want to caution that in the current environment we're in, patience is key. They might need more time to respond, to make interview decisions. When you are following up, though, you'll probably be following up via email. Make sure you have a direct subject line. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. Always lead. Remember, don't bury the lead. Lead with the position. HR professionals, hiring managers have a lot going on right now. Make sure you mention the position right away. And remember, be brief, polite, and to the point. A follow-up is not another interview. A follow-up is just that, a follow-up. So we want to make sure we're being brief and to the point, not taking up the hiring manager's time with trying to do an interview via email. But here's the key to a good follow-up. The key is it starts during the interview. So if you're about to go into a virtual interview, I want you to write this down. You know, you always want to ask questions to the hiring manager, but ask about the hiring process and the projected timeline at the end of your interview. Simply ask this and then make note of that timeline and then stick to the timeline. If they tell you, we won't be making a hiring decision until May, the end of May, don't follow up during May. You see what I mean? Stick to the timeline. It shows that you're paying attention and following instructions. Okay, so one of the most important elements of communication when I teach public speaking classes or just communication classes is read the room, know your audience. But how does that play right now, right? We're not in a room together. We're communicating on the computer, right? So how do we adjust this? And the 3 points that I think we need to add into our virtual communication is empathy, right? Realize we're all adjusting. Flexibility. We all need to be a bit more flexible. And then awareness. Awareness goes back to what we were discussing earlier, where we don't want to be tone deaf about what people are going through, right? So I traditionally would say, read the room. But if you can't read the room, just make sure you're adding in empathy, flexibility, and awareness. All right, let's move on to some actual Netiquette tips. So when I teach etiquette, I break my etiquette trainings down into 3 areas: social etiquette, business etiquette, and netiquette. Today we're going to focus on netiquette, but I want to point out in the current environment, we have to combine all 3 at the same time, right? We're doing business online, we're socializing online, and then we still have the netiquette tips, right? So we have to find that sweet spot where we're combining all 3 at the same time. And I know as Golden Hurricane, we can do that. So let's get into some of these practical netiquette tips you can use. But before we do, I have to share with you my etiquette golden rule. So now that you're about to learn some more etiquette tips, I want you to make a promise to yourself you're using your etiquette knowledge for good. The ultimate faux pas is when you point out if someone else has an etiquette misstep. Never correct someone, never tell them, "Oh, that's not proper etiquette." That's not what etiquette's about. Etiquette's about making people you're communicating with feel comfortable and welcome. It's not about being snobby or rude. So this is my etiquette golden rule, and I ask for you to adhere to this. We never point out someone's mistake. We never critique someone. We just focus on our own actions because we want to make sure people are comfortable and welcomed when they're communicating with us. I love this quote. that every interaction counts, even the small ones. Okay, let's jump right into email. First thing you need to look at is your email signature block. If you have an office phone number on there that you are no longer checking, you need to remove that. You want to make sure your contact information is correct on your signature block. And speaking of signature block, rethink the image of your signature. There's a current trend where people are signing their name and putting an image of their signature on their signature block. Security experts, security consultants tell us this is a bad idea. So go ahead and remove that. You want to make sure your signature block looks professional, obviously, but you don't need your actual signature on there. Respond to the message in the manner it was received. Meaning, if you receive an email from an employer, respond via email. Do not call them back to answer their question. And the reason for this is you're helping the other person with their record keeping. So if someone emails you and you do not respond, but you call them, they could easily forget you made that phone call. And then when they're searching for your response in their inbox and they can't find it, it will seem like you did not respond. So even if your answer is too long for an email, respond to the email and say, I would like to discuss this further. When would be a good time to call, right? You want to make sure there's a record of your response. Same thing. If they called you and left a voicemail, don't email them or text them back. Give them the courtesy of a call back. Remember, the subject line in any email is very important. This, once again, helps with organization and also spam, right? We know that there's certain things we include in a subject line that make it look like spam. So you don't want to use too many exclamation marks or all caps or all lowercase or emojis, right? The more of that extra you put in a subject line, the more likely it is to be disregarded as spam. So make sure the subject line is clear and direct. You also want to make sure that you're considerate of server and security restrictions right now when you're sending attachments. Well, always. If you're sending a very large attachment, you may want to ask prior to sending. Also, you want to make sure the attachments are properly titled. I know for whatever scanning app you use, we'll probably just give a very generic title to the document, with numbers and letters. Take the time to title the attachment properly so people know what the attachment is. Also, you never want to send an incomplete email. The trick for this is to add the recipient's email address last, right? Draft your email, do your spell check, your grammar check, properly attach the attachments, then add in the email address so you don't accidentally press send. Also, you want to make sure you're checking spelling and grammar. Business emails should be treated like a traditional business correspondence, a letter. So avoid, emoji use, abbreviations, things like that. But also you would spell check a letter. You want to spell check your email. There's a lot of great apps out there, for spell checking, for grammar. Look into those apps, download them, make sure you're checking it. You also want to set a time frame for responding and confirming that you've received an email. So if your employer emails you and asks for something you don't know, you have to do research. Don't just leave them hanging until the research is completed. Can respond and say, I received this email, I will be researching, I'll get back to you by whatever date. But you want to make sure your reasonable time period is there. A lot of companies, goes back to the protocols, are saying if you're working from home, you need to respond to emails, within 48, 72 hours. Follow your company's rule. And if you're not currently working for a company that has a rule, set your own personal rule of when you will respond to emails. Respect the privacy of others, right? If you receive an email that's not intended for you, make sure you let the sender know that you inadvertently received that email. And let's go through an email checklist. A lot of this is from Jeff Toyster, who is one of my favorite customer service experts. If you haven't read Jeff's book, I've listed it here. It's the customer service tip of the week. So when you're drafting business emails, you want to talk about tone, right? Is it friendly? Readability. Do you have proper grammar, punctuation, spelling? You want to make sure that it's easily readable. Action oriented. Did you get to the main point in the first paragraph of the email? Once again, don't bury the lead. We're all busy. Get to the point. Also, is it helpful? Right? What's the purpose of the email? You also want to make sure you're considering the image of any email you send. Is it professionally written? Is it in that professional tone? And then always add in, what is your time frame for responding to emails? Let's talk about some email faux pas. First of all, the use of reply all. I know everyone out there has a story of how they've been annoyed by reply all. The typical rule for reply all is you only use reply all if everyone on that email chain needs to know the information you're sharing. So you don't want to use reply all to a company email and say, got it, thanks, I'll be there, right? Consider use of reply all, use it sparingly. We talked about this, but remember, you don't want to treat business emails like social interaction, social correspondence, right? And the big thing with that is emoji use and abbreviation use, right? Not everyone will understand all the abbreviations. Also, people use different platforms for email, so your emoji might not come through. Remember, context is everything. So I really encourage you to go back through this checklist before you send emails to employers. All right, and remember, all caps is yelling, right? A lot of people know this, some people don't, but remember, all caps is yelling, and be aware of autocorrect, right? Whatever device you're using to email, make sure that you are checking for autocorrect mistakes. All right, let's move on to phone calls. So want to make sure you have a voicemail greeting. A lot of us just use the default one. Make sure you have a voicemail greeting. And remember, you create a first impression every time you answer the phone, right? That's what you have to practice. In a lot of customer service trainings, we practice on different ways to make sure your tone sounds positive. But the one thing we all know is body posture impacts your tone when you answer the phone. So whatever you need to do, like I said, you know yourself best, whether it be standing up when you answer the phone, putting your shoulders back, smiling, whatever you need to do, just remember your body posture will impact your tone, and you want to create that positive first impression. Also, use a standard professional greeting when you're taking phone calls for business. Also, if you are putting someone on speakerphone, let them know. This is especially important if others are in the room with you and they can hear the conversation. Even if it's just a family member or a roommate, you want to give that courtesy. Remember, I like texting more than I like talking on the phone. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. But we're going to have to really increase our phone calls during this time of working from home. So when you call someone, don't just for a business purpose, don't just let them have a missed call from you. Remember to leave a proper voicemail, right? And that's a greeting. Hi, this is Sarah. I'm calling you to discuss XYZ. Please call me back at, thank you, right? It's that simple. But we all need to get in the habit of actually leaving a voicemail and not just having a missed call for someone. Let them know why you're calling and what your request is. And remember, please and thank you are still magical words for phone calls. So conference calls, you want to always identify yourself at the beginning of the call. If it's a very large conference call and there's going to be a transcript taken, you want to identify yourself before you start speaking every time, right? So you're going to introduce yourself at the beginning, but then if you're making a point, this is Sarah. This helps with the transcript so they know who's saying what. Remember, if you're hosting a conference call, send out an agenda prior to the call. This is key for communicating on conference calls right now. We all know this, but use your mute button when you're not speaking. You want to make sure that people can't hear your background noise. And remember, always assume you're being recorded during a conference call. Once again, humor does not come across very well if you're not in person. And the number one thing is don't interrupt. When I do trainings, this is always a number one complaint, and this will only go up. And the reason for this is not that we're being rude, but because you often don't know when someone is done speaking. So don't interrupt, be considerate of this, just take notes, and you can always follow up at the end when you do get a chance to speak. All right, let's talk about video conferences. Always want to test your technology before your video conference starts, right? We don't want to waste people's time. And remember, if you wouldn't do it in person, don't do it on the video. So if you wouldn't sit in a conference room with your boss in person snacking or brushing your hair, whatever it might be, don't do it on video. But we also want to make sure we're giving people flexibility, right? If someone's dog comes up, if someone's kid comes up, we're all just human. We're going to be polite and nice. But what I'm talking about is things you can control and that you wouldn't typically do at work, you know, don't eat, things like that. Remember, I'm loving the different Zoom backgrounds, but you want to make sure your background's appropriate. There's social backgrounds and there's business backgrounds. And this is a real world etiquette tip, but don't be late, right? That counts for video conferences too. If you wouldn't be late for a meeting in person, don't be late for a meeting on a video conference. Again, I'm reiterating these that we talked about on the phone because they're so important. Don't interrupt. Let the person complete their thought before you add to it, and then use the mute button when you're not speaking. And something I want us to consider before we wrap up is in the current environment, the social and the business lines will blur, right? Remember earlier we talked about the 3 areas of etiquette and we have to know all 3. We're going to really see this line blurring with social media, right? We're probably going to interact much more on social media with our employers than we have before. I work with some people who bosses would never interact with their employees on a social media platform. But in the last month, they have changed course because social media can be such a positive, easy way to communicate with your workforce. So with that being said, we want to think about that, right? We already know that people are using social media for work, regardless of the company's policy. But that's not always bad, right? We know that 78% of people who are using their personal social media pages are doing it to solve work-related problems and to foster relationships with coworkers, right? So it's not always bad. This blurring is not bad. But I want to point this out because I think it's really important now that you're using your social media pages to generate positive content about yourself, right? And I always like to say this, think before you post, right? Pause, view it objectively, right? Spell check it, and then trim it. We know that most social media posts are too long. So keep this in mind if you are seeing that you're interacting with your employer more on social media. Remember, your professional brand, your professional reputation goes also to your social media account. And we all know this. We have too many horror stories of this, but never send inappropriate content. This is for any virtual communication, social media, email, anything. We know not to send inappropriate content. And remember, good manners are just a way of showing other people that we have respect for them, right? It's not about being snooty. It's about just making people realize that we appreciate them and respect them. All right. So what's the path forward, right? We know that our ultimate target is to help our organization, help our employer with our communication, our workplace communication. But right now, we have to really focus on our interpersonal communication, right? We want to bridge that gap. So you can use some of these etiquette tips as simple as properly titling attachments to emails, to setting up a professional voicemail right now to help bridge that gap. And the one thing is I want to point out, we talked about this a little bit earlier, is that communication failures are going to happen. We're not going to do this perfectly, communicating virtually, but if something does happen and you do have a mistake, a failure, the best thing to do is to address it in a prompt and sincere manner, apologize and move on, right? Address it and move on. But the thing I want to leave you with is never underestimate a strong follow-up. If you have a communication failure with an employer, follow up strong, right? You want to email, call, apologize, and move on. So I want to show that quote again because it's my favorite. And I know it is time now to move on to the question and answers. Here, as promised, you can find me on LinkedIn to ask questions or shoot me an email. I'd be happy to respond. Here's my screen. There's my blog. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brooke so we can get into your questions at this time. Thank you for listening.
Awesome. Sarah, feel free to leave your contact information up. That way everyone has access to that, just in case they haven't had a chance to write it down. First and foremost, thank you so much. That was awesome. I took 3 pages of notes, so I hope everyone was paying as good of attention as I was. We do have a few questions so far, so if you guys do have questions, feel free to send them in on the Q&A, and I'm going to go ahead and start with our first one. Where should I look when doing a virtual interview? How do I best let my interviewer know that I'm listening and attentive?
That's a great question. So I think when you're doing a virtual interview, you would want to use the typical etiquette rule of maintaining eye contact. When you're in-person interviews, we know eye contact is the most important. In person, I always say my big 3 for interviews is eye contact, smile, and shaking their hands, right? So you can do that by focusing right on the camera. However, it's also important to let them know you're taking notes. So what you do is when you say that you're listening and attentive is let them know that, after the introduction, say, thank you. And be honest, I'm taking notes. So if they see you look down, like I'm doing right now, they know what you're doing. And the best way to let your interviewer know that I'm listening and attentive is any active listening skills you have. So active listening skills, we don't have time to get into that, but one of the best ones is after you write something down, repeat it to them in a question. So if they say something, take your note and say, just to make sure I got this, right? We are going to do that more in virtual situations, where in a personal situation, an in-person situation, you might think that's over communicating. But for now, it's okay. Over communicate when you're virtually communicating.
Great. Okay, round 2 is, as an etiquette trainer, what is your favorite and most used etiquette tip in the business setting?
Oh, that's a great question. I think my favorite business etiquette tip is, I have a lot. So maybe I'll do my first 2. My first 2 is probably what I call the bookend. So it's a strong, we kind of talked about this, but a strong beginning and a strong end. So when you walk into a business situation, you want to have a strong introduction, right? You want to always use your first and last name when you're introducing yourself. Don't just say, hi, I'm Sarah. Hello, I'm Sarah Brown. And then the second one is the bookend, where when you always thank them for their time. So I think strong beginning, strong end. And then my other favorite tip, I'll add one more, is probably body posture when you're sitting in a meeting with someone, right? So simple things like sitting up in your chair and then not being on your cell phone in a business environment are my favorite tips.
Good, those are good. I like both of those. Okay, from a student perspective, what is the best way for me to stand out to future employers online?
That's a great question as well. So I think that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the social and business lines blurring, especially right now. And I think the way that you stand out online is to make sure your presence is the same. Meaning, if you are professional on LinkedIn, emails, things like that, but then you have a public Twitter account that maybe is not the same, that's the best way to get negative attention. So that means it's also the best way for you to stand out online, right? The best way to stand out online is where you have a concise and clear image across every platform.
Great. Okay. Chris asked, how long is best to wait for a video appointment that is late?
Oh, that's a great question. So, Chris, the etiquette rule is for every minute you're going to be late, you're supposed to give the person a 2-minute notice. So that'd be if you're going to be 10 minutes late, someone should know 20 minutes in advance. But that's not really the situation here because you're the one waiting. There's no solid answer in the etiquette world for this, but what I recommend is 15 minutes and then do a follow-up. Remember, I always say never underestimate the importance of a strong follow-up. At the 15-minute mark, then reach out to whoever you're trying to meet with, probably via email, saying, I just want to let you know I'm here. Let me know if there's another link I should go to. Always assume it's a technical issue and they're not being rude. So that's why that follow-up is important, to let them know that you're engaged, but 15 minutes.
Good call on that. I like that. Okay, Haley has a question. She said, when working 100% remotely, my coworkers are in a different state. What is the best way to foster friendly working relationships and to get to know coworkers without the ability to have short social chats like you would in person, like you would for in-person coworkers?
That's a great question. You know, we talked about that one of the goals of communication is relationship building. So it is very difficult. The best way to do that is just basic conversation skills at the end of a conversation. So, for example, we always want to lead with the business, right? Don't bury the lead. Get to your point at the beginning of any email, the beginning of any phone call. But then at the end, you know, then it would be appropriate to ask some of those relationship building things, right? The one that I am getting a lot is, what are you watching on Netflix, right? So at the end of the conversation, I think is the best way to do it. But I kind of want to switch courses here a little bit. I think the most important thing we can do right now with our coworkers is inclusion. So if you're having a coworker trivia on Zoom, make sure everyone is included, because I'm getting some of that for some of my clients where we all know clicks impact a workplace and virtual clicks exist. So I think at the end of communications, you can add some of those social conversations, but at the same time, remember inclusion, right? I am okay with people sending emails just to checking in, right? Hi, Sarah, just checking in to see how you're doing, things like that. So don't be afraid to do an extra email that's not specifically work related, but that's just relationship building. I think that's great and a good idea right now.
That's great advice. I like that a lot. Do you guys have any other questions as far as we go right now? That's the end of our question stream. So if you have anything else, now or never. All right. It looks like that's going to be it. If anything pops up in the next few moments, I'll let you know. Thank you everyone who came out today to take on this webinar. I think it's been just a great set of advice and maybe a different perspective than what we've heard before. So Sarah, thank you again for bringing this information and putting it in front of us. I think even myself as a career coach got little tidbits of things that I can incorporate into my day-to-day use. So really appreciate your time. For all of you that are viewing today for the webinar, there will be a brief survey that will be sent out to your email. If you would kindly fill that out for us, it would really help us out. It would also give you an opportunity to make some requests for if there are topics that you're looking for in the future. Other than that, I hope everyone has a great day. The sun is shining here in Tulsa, so hopefully you get to get some sunshine today. All right, Sarah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.